Land of the Echidna People by Percy Trezise. Introduction. Aboriginal oral history tells of hundreds of dream roads crisscrossing the Australian continent, which were made by ancestral beings during their travels at the beginning of Dreamtime. It also tells of a vast freshwater lake at the top of Australia, and stories about ancestors like the Antamoola sisters. There is also scientific evidence to suggest that 36,000 years ago there was a large freshwater lake at the top of Australia. Scientists called it the Lake of Carpentaria, and it was also known as Ballinaga, the Big Water. This is the story of three children and their journey around Ballinaga, along the dream road of the Antamoola sisters to find their way home. The Katamakara children had travelled north at night by the light of a large comet, which Lande thought might be Gurialla, the rainbow serpent. As a result, their journey through the land of the Barramundian crocodile peoples was uneventful. They were now in the land of the Flying Fox people, who had many brave warriors because they had to defend their lands from raids by the cruel crocodile men of the south. The Flying Fox people were friends of the Katamakara people, as they were one of the clans with whom they exchanged their young women for wives. The Katamakara children hoped to meet Kylie, their father's youngest sister, who was married to a Flying Fox man and lived somewhere along the lake shore. The three travellers were passing through long grass near the lake shore when Lande stepped on the tail of a large snake hiding there. The snake reared up and bit her on the thigh. Lande screamed and hit the snake with her digging stick, so it let her go. Jadianta turned and was horrified to see the snake about to bite Lande again. He pulled a boomerang out of his belt and struck the snake hard just below its head, breaking its neck. The snake was writhing on the ground, and Jadianta was relieved to see it was a black-headed python, not poisonous. It could have been a dreaded taipan. Lande's leg was bleeding and sore, but she limped to a small creek to wash it clean and tie a pad of soft paper bark over it. Jadianta killed the snake and took it to cook over a fire, while Lande rested to ease the pain. They all enjoyed a feast of snake. Later that afternoon they saw gunyahs and people by the shore. As they drew near, there was a loud shriek of disbelief, and they recognised their Aunt Kylie running towards them, crying with joy, saying, "We heard you were all lost, drowned in Ballinaga long ago. How wonderful to find you all alive and well." It was decided that Lunday needed rest to get over the pain and shock of the snake bite, and Kylie said she would go with Jadianta to the nearest rainforest to make a healing package of special leaves for the bite, and to get fruit and nuts for them to eat. It was cool in the beautiful rainforest, where Kylie found trees with sweet black figs and others with large dark red plums to fill their dilly bags. Jadianta used his boomerang to knock down the fruit where Kylie found the shrub with dark green leaves to be crushed and heated over fire to heal Lunde's bitten leg. The Katamakara children still had many days of walking to get home, and Kylie said the best dry food to carry was the sweet mucka nuts, which had just ripened and fallen to the ground in another part of the forest. They found a grove of mucka trees, and the ground beneath them was thick with nuts. Kylie pointed out the big nut stones, which had been placed there to crack the nuts open. Each stone had some small pits in the top to hold the nut, while its hard shell was smashed with a smaller rock. They spent the afternoon cracking and storing nuts for the children to collect when they set off for home. Lande's leg had healed after a few days' rest, and now they were close to home. The children were anxious to get there. It was becoming hotter, and the first thunderstorms of the next wet season would soon be seen. They said goodbye to Kylie and the Flying Fox people, then went into the rainforest to fill their dilly bags with maca nuts. When they emerged from the rainforest, they found a flying fox colony with huge numbers of the animals hanging in clusters in the trees. They were sacred to the Flying Fox people, but not to the Katamakara, so Jadianta decided to get some for dinner. The bats screeched in alarm and flew wildly about as Jadianta's boomerang crashed among the cloud of bats, and he got 6 of them. The next afternoon, the first thunderstorms of the coming wet season burst around the children. Lightning flashed, thunder roared overhead, and a wall of heavy white rain engulfed them. They were passing through rocky country and were lucky enough to find shelter under a rock overhang to protect them from the dangerous lightning hitting trees nearby. Jadianta watched the heavy rain filling small gullies and creeks and hoped they could cross the last big river, the boundary between the Flying Fox and Echidna peoples, before it flooded. Rafting across a flooded river was dangerous, but home was only a few days' walk away once it was crossed. They came to the last big river the next day, just as the sun was setting. The water was high, but Jadianta decided it would be safe to cross if they could find a good walper. They walked upstream until they found 2 walpers tied to the bank. They loaded their gear into the largest one and began to paddle across the river. Near the other side, Jadianta noticed the current was getting stronger and the river was rising. There had been more storms upstream and another flood was coming. Jadianta got the front of the walper to the bank and Lande jumped ashore, pulling Jalmor with her. Just then, a big tree trunk swept along on the rising flood, hit the walper and carried it downstream, with Jadianta and Luska clinging on. They were swept along the raging river, and Jadianta saw they were approaching a range of low hills and the river passed through a natural tunnel under the hills. They would be drowned in the tunnel. Lande and Jalmor watched in horror as the walper carrying Jadianta and Luska was swept into the tunnel. It struck one side and they were hurled into the water and into the tunnel to their certain death. The 2 young Katamakara children wailed in great sorrow. Their brave older brother, Jadianta, and their faithful dingo, Luska, who had saved them from so many terrible troubles, were both gone, and so close to home. They turned and ran toward home, crying. After 3 days crossing the land of the Echidna people, it was nearly dark when Lande and Jalmor arrived home. Their parents, Warumbi and Magura, cried with joy to get their 2 little ones back, and everyone wailed loudly when they heard how Jadianta and Luska were lost so close to home. The people were getting ready to move back to their cave homes for the coming storm season, and they decided to go to the fatal river to try to find Jadianta's body for a proper burial. However, they would not find Jadianta's body, because when the walper struck the side of the tunnel, Jadianta was knocked unconscious and was unaware that he fell back on the walper as it was swept into the dark tunnel. It was huge inside, and the swirling floodwaters carried the walper up onto a huge rockfall inside the tunnel. Jadianta woke up to feel floodwaters swirling around his legs. He crawled high on the rocks and bumped into a shivering Luska, also swept up there with other animals in the dim light. He saw the walper and realized they might be able to escape when the floodwaters went down. A long time later, Jadianta woke again when Luska licked his face, and he saw daylight far off, where the tunnel ended and the river flowed out of. Jadianta pushed the walper free of the rocks, and Luska jumped on it. They floated toward the sunlight at the end of the tunnel, clear now because the floodwaters were gone. Jadianta used his hands to paddle the walper up to the bank. Followed by Luska, Jadianta climbed up and crossed the low hills of the tunnel range. From the top he could see they would soon be home with Lande and Jalmor. The Katamakara family approached the tunnel range, and Lande was pointing out the tunnel when they saw the 2 figures on top of the ridge. Lande and Jalmor ran forward calling, it's Jad and Luska, we are all home safe at last." After a complete round of seasons full of adventure, the brave Katamakara children were back home with their family. Jadianta, Lande and Jalmor have overcome many dangers on their journey home to the land of the Katamakara people. Now they are reunited with their parents at last. Glossary: Ancestral beings. People who came down from the stars at creation time and turned into every species of life on earth, animal and plant. Balanorga, the name for the Great Lake. Bala equals big, Norga equals water. Digging stick, wooden tool used to dig out underground food, like roots. Dilly bag, generally a bag woven from the fibres of the leaves of the pandanus tree. Dreamtime, the time of the creating of ancestral beings. Gunya, a circular hut covered with paper bark. Mucka, shortened name for macadamia, a type of Australian nut. Paperbark, a melaleuca tree which has a papery bark with medicinal properties. Walper, a raft.